The boy had not spoken in 11 months. Clara Brennan did not know this when she knocked on the door of the ranch house outside Bitterroot Valley, with flour dust still on her sleeves and her carpet bag heavy enough to pull her shoulder down. She did not know that the man who opened the door, tall and sun-darkened, with eyes that looked like they had forgotten how to focus on anything closer than the horizon, had written the advertisement in the Montana Gazette, in handwriting so careful it looked like a child's, because his hands had been shaking. She did not know that the boy was standing in the shadows behind his father, watching her with the kind of stillness that comes from holding your breath underwater. All she knew was that the man said, "You are the baker," and she said, "I am," and he stepped aside without another word. That was when she smelled it. Smoke, burnt sugar. The ghost of something that had gone so wrong in that kitchen it had left a stain in the air. If you know what it means to walk into a house where something vital has stopped working, you understand the tightness in your chest right now. This is the story of a woman who came to bake bread for a man who had forgotten how to feed himself, and a boy who had locked every word he knew behind his teeth, and what happened the morning that boy finally opened his mouth. If stories like this are the ones that stay with you long after you close your eyes, subscribe so the next one finds you. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story can travel. Because what Clara Brennan would learn, standing in that burnt-smelling kitchen with a silent child watching her from the shadows, was that some things cannot be fixed with words. Some things require yeast and time and heat and the kind of patience that only comes from knowing what it means to start over. Clara was 41 years old. She had spent the last 18 of them running a bakery in Copper Falls with her husband, a German immigrant named Ernst, who had taught her everything he knew about bread. The way dough should feel under your hands, the sound a loaf makes when it is done, the science of temperature and fermentation that separated good bread from the kind people remembered for the rest of their lives. When Ernst died in the influenza outbreak of 1891, Clara had kept the bakery open for 6 months, working 16-hour days, sleeping on a cot in the back room, baking through grief because it was the only thing she knew how to do. But the debts Ernst had hidden from her came due in January of 1892, and by March, the bakery belonged to the bank. She was a large woman, not delicate, not the kind who could fade into the background of a room. She took up space, she always had. In Copper Falls, that had been acceptable because she was useful, because the bread she made was worth the discomfort people felt when they had to stand too close to her in the shop. When the bakery closed, that usefulness evaporated, and she learned quickly what it meant to be visible without being valued. She took in laundry, she cleaned houses, she worked in the kitchen of the hotel for 3 weeks until the owner's wife decided Clara made the dining room look too crowded and let her go without explanation. When she saw the advertisement, "Wanted, baker for remote ranch, room and board, winter term, no references required," she did not hesitate. She wrote her reply that night, mailed it the next morning, and had her trunk packed before the response arrived. She took the stage to Bitterroot Valley on the 1st of November. The ranch was 12 miles outside of town, accessible only by a road that turned to mud in the spring and disappeared entirely under snow in the winter. The rancher, Silas Grant, met her at the crossroads with a wagon and a horse that looked as tired as he did. He was in his middle 30s, she guessed, though grief had a way of aging a man past counting. He did not make conversation during the ride. He asked if her trunk was secure. He pointed out the boundary markers for his land. He told her the house had a separate kitchen building out back where she would be working. That was all. The boy, his son Thomas, sat between them on the bench, silent as stone, staring straight ahead with his hands folded in his lap. He was 8 years old, maybe 9, with dark hair and his father's sharp cheekbones, and eyes that looked like they were watching something no one else could see. When they arrived at the ranch, Silas carried her trunk into the small room off the main house and said, "You will sleep here. Kitchen is out back. I need bread every day, biscuits, pies if you can manage it. I can pay $40 for the season." Then he paused, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked directly at her. He said, "My son does not speak. He has not spoken since his mother died. Do not try to make him. Do not ask him questions. Do not expect him to answer you. Do you understand?" Clara nodded. She said, "I understand." Silas looked at her for another long moment, as if he were deciding whether to believe her. Then he walked out. Clara unpacked her trunk. She had brought her apron, her grandmother's wooden spoon, a sourdough starter she had been feeding for 9 years, and a small notebook where Ernst had written down every recipe he had perfected in 40 years of baking. She changed into her work dress, tied her apron, and walked out to the kitchen building. It was worse than she had imagined. The stove was coated in grease and ash. The work table was scarred and filthy. There were no measuring cups, no proper bowls, no proofing baskets. The flour was stored in a barrel that had not been sealed properly and was half infested with weevil. The lard had gone rancid. There was a Dutch oven in the corner, with something burnt into the bottom so thoroughly it looked like tar. Clara stood in the doorway and felt the same thing she had felt the day the bank took her bakery. A cold, clear understanding that she had walked into a disaster and the only way out was through. She rolled up her sleeves. She scrubbed the stove. She scraped the work table. She threw out the infested flour and the rancid lard and made a list of what she would need from town. Then she looked at what was left. Clean flour in a crate Silas must have purchased for her arrival, salt, a little sugar, water from the pump outside, and her sourdough starter. She could work with that. She had worked with less. She fed her starter. She mixed dough. She kneaded it on the table until her shoulders burned, shaped it into a round, and set it to proof near the stove, where the residual heat would wake the yeast. While she waited, she made biscuits from scratch. Flour, lard, buttermilk she found in the cold box, a pinch of salt. She baked them in the Dutch oven after she had scrubbed it clean, and when they came out golden and steaming, she set them on a plate and carried them into the main house. Silas and Thomas were sitting at the table in silence. There was no food in front of them. Silas looked up when Clara entered, and she saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, maybe, or suspicion. She set the plate down. She said, "These are still warm." Then she turned and walked back to the kitchen before either of them could respond. She baked the bread that evening. When she pulled it from the oven, the crust crackled under her knuckles, and the smell, yeast and wheat and heat, filled the kitchen so completely it felt like a living thing. She let it cool, wrapped it in a clean cloth, and brought it to the house. Silas was standing near the stove. Thomas was sitting in the same chair he had been sitting in earlier, staring at the wall. Clara set the loaf on the table. She said, "This will be better in the morning, but you can eat it tonight if you are hungry." Silas looked at the bread. He looked at her. He said, "Thank you." She nodded and left. The next morning, when she returned to the main house to start breakfast, the loaf was gone. Not a crumb remained. Silas was outside already, working. Thomas was sitting at the table in the exact same position, but his eyes followed Clara as she moved through the room. She made porridge. She fried eggs. She toasted slices of the second loaf she had baked that morning and brought them to the table with butter and honey. Thomas ate without looking up. But when Clara turned to go back to the kitchen, she heard the scrape of his chair and the soft sound of his footsteps behind her. She looked back. He was standing in the doorway, watching her. She said, "You can come out to the kitchen if you want, but you will have to stay out of the way." He did not answer, but he followed her. That became the pattern. Every morning Thomas followed Clara to the kitchen and sat on the stool in the corner, watching. He did not speak. He did not ask questions. He simply watched her work, watched her measure flour by feel, watched her knead dough with the heels of her hands, watched her shape rolls and braid loaves and score the tops with a knife before they went into the oven. Clara did not try to make him talk. She did not ask him to help. She worked and he watched, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who understood that some things do not require words. By the third week, Thomas had started handing her things before she asked for them. A bowl, a towel, the crock of sourdough starter. He anticipated her movements the way a good assistant does, and Clara began to rely on him without realizing it. When she reached for the flour, his hand was already on the scoop. When she needed the butter, he had already retrieved it from the cold box. He was learning the rhythm of bread the way she had learned it, by watching, by doing, by becoming part of the process. Silas noticed. One evening in early December after supper, he said, "Thomas spends all his time in the kitchen now." Clara was washing dishes. She said, "He does not get in the way." Silas was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He used to follow his mother like that." Clara stopped washing. She dried her hands on her apron and turned to look at him. She said, "What happened to her?" Silas stared into his coffee. He said, "She drowned last winter." She went to the creek to fetch water, and the ice broke under her. Thomas was with her. He saw it happen. He has not spoken since. Clara felt something tighten in her chest. She said, "I am sorry." Silas said, "I do not know how to reach him. I have tried everything. The doctor in town said it might be permanent, that some people lose their words and never get them back." He looked up at Clara. He said, "But he follows you. He listens to you, even though you do not say much." Clara said, "Bread does not require talking. It requires paying attention." Silas nodded slowly, as if she had said something he had been waiting to hear. He said, "Keep doing what you are doing." The snow came in the second week of December. It fell for 3 days without stopping, and by the time it cleared, the ranch was buried under 4 feet of white. The kitchen building was connected to the main house by a covered walkway Silas had built years ago, but even that required shoveling twice a day. Clara worked in the cold, her breath fogging in front of her face, baking loaves and rolls and biscuits that she carried steaming into the house. Thomas continued to follow her, bundled in a coat too big for him, silent and watchful. One morning in late December, Clara was shaping dinner rolls when Thomas appeared at her elbow. He was holding the crock of sourdough starter. Clara smiled and said, "Not for these. These are yeast rolls. But thank you." She reached for the jar of yeast on the shelf, and that was when Thomas spoke. His voice was quiet and rusty, like a door hinge that had not been oiled in a long time. He said, "The bread you made yesterday was better." Clara stopped moving. She set the dough down. She turned to look at him, and Thomas was staring at her with wide eyes, as if he had startled himself. She said very carefully, "The sourdough loaf?" He nodded. She said, "You are right. It was better. Would you like me to make another one today?" He nodded again. Then he said, "It smells like spring." Clara felt tears prick the corners of her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She said, "That is the best thing anyone has ever said about my bread." Then she reached out and rested her hand on top of his head for just a moment. He did not pull away. When Silas came in for lunch that day, Thomas was sitting at the table eating a slice of fresh sourdough bread with butter and honey. Clara was at the stove, stirring soup, and she did not look up when Silas walked in. But she heard him stop. She heard the sharp intake of his breath. And then she heard him say very quietly, "Thomas?" Thomas looked up. He said, "The bread smells like spring." Silas stood frozen in the doorway. His face had gone pale. He said, "You—" His voice broke. He tried again. "You are talking." Thomas nodded. He said, "Miss Clara makes good bread." Silas looked at Clara. She saw in his face every emotion a father can feel when something impossible happens. Shock and relief and gratitude so fierce it bordered on pain. He said, "How did you—" Clara shook her head. She said, "I did not do anything. He was ready." Silas crossed the room. He knelt beside his son's chair and pulled the boy into his arms, and Thomas led him. For the first time in 11 months, the boy who had stopped speaking let his father hold him, and he did not pull away. That night, after Thomas had gone to bed, Silas asked Clara to sit. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table, and then he sat across from her and said, "I do not know how to thank you." Clara said, "You do not have to thank me." He said, "Yes, I do. You brought my son back." She said, "I baked bread. That is all." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "When I wrote that advertisement, I was looking for someone to bake. That was all I wanted. Someone to do the thing I could not do anymore because I was too tired and too broken to keep trying. I did not expect—" He stopped. He looked at his hands. He said, "I did not expect someone like you." Clara said, "Someone like me?" He said, "Someone who pays attention. Someone who does not need to be told what matters. Someone who understands that silence is not the same as emptiness." He looked up at her. He said, "My wife was like that. She could walk into a room and know what was needed without anyone saying a word. I thought that was gone. I thought I would never have that again." Clara felt her throat tighten. She said, "You are grieving. You are tired. You do not need to say these things." He said, "I am saying them because they are true, and because I need you to know that if you want to stay past the winter, if you want to stay permanently, I am asking you to." Clara looked at him. She saw a man who had been broken and had learned to keep breathing anyway. She saw a man who had a son who was learning to speak again. She saw a future that was not the life she had planned, but might be the life she needed. She said, "What would I do?" He said, "Whatever you want. Bake. Teach Thomas. Help me run this place. I cannot pay you much more than I am paying you now, but the house is yours as much as it is mine. The kitchen is yours. This land is yours if you want it." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because my son spoke today for the first time in 11 months, and the first thing he said was about your bread. Because this house was dead before you came, and now it is not. Because I look forward to coming inside at the end of the day, and I have not felt that way since my wife died. Because you are—" He stopped. He looked at her. He said, "Because you are exactly what we needed, and I did not know we needed you until you were here." Clara was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I will stay." The town of Bitterroot Valley learned about the arrangement in January, when Silas brought Clara and Thomas to the general store to buy supplies. The owner, a sharp-faced woman named Mrs. Hollis, looked Clara up and down the way people always looked at her, with a kind of measuring disdain that made Clara want to turn around and walk back out. But before Mrs. Hollis could say anything, Thomas stepped forward and said, very clearly, "Miss Clara needs flour, and yeast, and sugar. She is the best baker in Montana." Mrs. Hollis blinked. She said, "Well, that is quite an endorsement." Silas said, "It is the truth. My son has not spoken in almost a year. The first words he said were about her bread. If that is not proof of quality, I do not know what is." Mrs. Hollis looked at Clara again, and this time there was something different in her eyes. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of cautious respect. She said, "What do you need?" Clara told her. Mrs. Hollis filled the order without comment, and when Clara went to pay, Silas put his hand over hers and said, "I will handle it." Clara started to protest, but he shook his head. He said, "You are family now. Let me do this." On the way home, Thomas sat between them on the wagon bench and talked. Not constantly, and not about anything important, just small observations about the snow and the horses and the way the sky looked before a storm. But it was enough. It was everything. And when they arrived back at the ranch, and Thomas jumped down from the wagon and ran to the kitchen to help Clara unload the supplies, Silas stood in the yard for a long moment and watched them go. Then he turned to the barn, and Clara saw him wipe his eyes before he disappeared inside. The years that followed were good years. Clara stayed through that winter and the spring that came after it. She stayed through the summer, when Thomas learned to read by studying the recipes in her notebook. She stayed through the winter when the cattle prices fell, and Silas thought he might lose the ranch, and Clara sold her bread in town to bring in extra money. She stayed through the year Thomas turned 12 and started working the ranch alongside his father. She stayed through the year Silas asked her, very quietly one evening after supper, if she would consider marrying him, and she said yes, not because she needed the security, but because she had come to love the man who had hired her to bake and had given her a reason to stay. They married in the spring of 1895 in the small church in Bitterroot Valley. Thomas stood beside his father. Clara wore a dress she had sewn herself from blue calico. The preacher said the words, and Silas kissed her. And afterward they went home to the ranch, and Clara baked a wedding cake that Thomas said was the best thing he had ever eaten. Thomas grew up. He married a girl from town and brought her to live on the ranch. They had 3 children, and every one of them learned to bake bread in Clara's kitchen, standing on stools to reach the work table, their small hands covered in flour. Silas grew older, but not slower, and every evening he came in from the fields and found Clara in the kitchen, and every evening he kissed the top of her head and asked what she was making. She always had an answer. When Silas died in the winter of 1923, Clara buried him on the ridge overlooking the ranch, with a headstone that read, "He knew what mattered." Thomas stood beside her at the graveside, a grown man with gray in his hair, and he said, "He loved you more than anything except me." Clara said, "I know." Thomas said, "And I loved you more than anything except him." Clara looked at him. She said, "I know that too." She lived another 12 years. She baked bread until her hands would not cooperate anymore, and then she taught Thomas's children to bake in her place. She sat in the kitchen on a chair by the stove and told stories about Ernst and the bakery in Copper Falls, and the day she had arrived at the ranch and smelled burnt sugar in the air. She told them about the morning Thomas had spoken for the first time, about the way his voice had sounded like a door opening after a long time shut. When Clara Brennan died in the autumn of 1935, the church in Bitterroot Valley was full. Thomas gave the eulogy. He said, "My mother drowned when I was 8 years old, and I stopped talking because I did not know what words could do anymore. And then a woman came to our ranch to bake bread. and she taught me that some things do not need words. Some things just need time and patience, and the willingness to show up every day and do the work. She gave me my voice back. She gave my father a reason to keep living. She gave me a childhood when mine had ended, and all she asked in return was flour and a warm stove and a family to feed. He paused. He looked at the casket. He said, "The last thing she told me was this: good bread takes time. You cannot rush it. You have to trust the process." I think she was talking about more than bread. They buried her beside Silas on the ridge. The headstone read, "She fed us all." And in the kitchen of the ranch house, on the shelf above the stove, there remained a crock of sourdough starter that had been fed every day for 43 years, passed from Clara to Thomas, from Thomas to his children, from his children to theirs. It is still there, still alive, still making bread that people say smells like spring.